Alright, time to get down to the nitty-gritty of the endocrine system. The thyroid and parathyroid are two glands that we can pair together. And that is because both of them secrete hormones that work together to control blood calcium levels. So the thyroid gland secretes three hormones: T3, T4, and calcitonin. The parathyroid gland secretes one hormone, PTH, parathyroid hormone. So as I talked about earlier, the hypothalamus is like the president of the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus secretes a hormone called TRH. So this is its messenger, thyroid releasing hormone. The thyroid releasing hormone talks to the vice president of the endocrine system, the anterior pituitary, and that causes the anterior pituitary to secrete TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Now, the thyroid stimulating hormone has to be released and communicate with an organ that's at a distance from the brain, such as the thyroid hormone. So let's say TSH is going to travel cross country, just like TSH travels through the brain, through the blood. Let's say it's going to reach Florida. Actually, no, let's do Texas, because everything's bigger in Texas, right? Just kidding. I'm just using Texas because T for Texas, T for thyroid. So let's do, I've actually never been to Texas myself. So anyway, so the TSH is going to travel down to into the bloodstream and reach the thyroid gland. And that is where the thyroid gland actually looks like this. And that is where we're going to have T3 and T4 production. And T3 and T4 production is what increases our cellular respiration, which is what we humans use to make energy, is what we use ATP to convert into energy to get on with our daily activities. Now let's look at a cycle. We're going to start off with PTH, parathyroid hormone. When we have high levels of PTH, that's going to signal our bones to break down, to release calcium into our blood. So we're going to have higher blood calcium levels. And this, like I just said, is a result of bone breakdown. So once we have high levels of calcium in the blood, we have to somehow compensate for this. We don't want them to get too high. And the way to do this, to counteract the high levels of calcium in the blood, is to stimulate another hormone, calcitonin. So I like to think of calcitonin, so the tone is going to tone down the levels of calcium in the blood. So calcitonin is actually going to cause the calcium to go back to being stored in our bone. So it's not in the bloodstream anymore. And once it's stored back in the bone, we are going to have less in the blood. So if we want more back into the blood, we have to go back and tell PTH to wake up and start producing more calcium into the blood. So let's look at negative feedback here. When we have too high levels of calcium in the blood, we have to tell the PTH to slow down and stop producing PTH so we don't have any more calcium in the blood. It's going to say, hey, there's already enough of me in the blood. Please stop producing more PTH. We already have enough. So it's going to negatively feedback back to the PTH. Same thing when we have a lot of calcium stored in the bone. It's going to say, hey, calcitonin, tone down a little bit. There's already enough in the bone, but I need more back in the blood. So it's going to cause feedback inhibition. So the pancreas's endocrine function is to release hormones that regulate our blood sugar. So there are two types of cells that the MCAT likes to test us on, and the first is alpha cells. The alpha cells secrete glucagon, and glucagon is responsible for bringing back up our blood glucose levels. The other one is the beta cells. The beta cells produce insulin, which brings down our too high levels of blood sugar. So let's look at a cycle again. Say after eating a rich carbohydrate meal, for example, a nice burger and fries or pasta, we're going to have a lot of blood glucose. So our blood glucose is going to rise. So high amounts of sugar in the blood. This is what gives us our energy for the day. However, when our blood sugar is too high, it's going to cause the alpha cells of the pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas to turn on and bring these sugar levels back down. So we're going to have increased insulin production. And when we have increased insulin production, the sugar levels go back down to a healthy range. Now, after a fast or after waking up in the morning before eating, we're really, really hungry. And that's because our blood sugar levels are really low. We haven't eaten in a while. So when we have low blood sugar levels, that's going to stimulate another hormone, glucagon. Glucagon is going to be produced to bring those sugar levels back up. It's going to cause increased glucose into the blood. And I like to remember this as glucagon. So glucagon is produced only when the glucose is gone. So once we have glucagon, our blood sugars are going to go back up. And negative feedback plays a role because when our blood sugar is too high, we have to tell the glucagon to somehow turn off. There's already enough sugar in the blood, and vice versa. When the sugar is too low, we need to tell the insulin to, hey, turn off. My sugar is already too low. No more insulin production. There's our negative feedback. The last gland we're going to look at are the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands are located right on top of our kidneys. So here are our kidneys, and they're located right on top. Now, the hypothalamus secretes a hormone, CRF, that we've talked about before. And CRF talks to the anterior pituitary to secrete ACTH. And this is what travels through our blood and reaches the adrenal glands. So it works in two fashions, though. So ACTH can either travel through the blood and reach the adrenal cortex, or it can travel through the blood and reach the adrenal medulla. Now, the medulla is the inner part of the gland, and the cortex is the outer part. So let's look at the cortex first. The cortex secretes 3 sets of hormones, and there's an easy way to remember these. The first is glucocorticoids, which are our sugar hormones. The second are the mineralocorticoids, which are our salt hormones. And the last are the cortical sex hormones, which are sex hormones. So the 3 S's, sugar, salt, sex. Now when we have glucocorticoids in our system, it's going to increase glucose synthesis. So an example of this is cortisol. When we have increased mineralocorticoids, that's going to increase sodium reabsorption in the kidneys. An example of that is aldosterone. And lastly, when we have the cortical sex hormones, that's going to increase the male sex hormones, or the androgens. Now, the medulla also releases 2 hormones that basically work together. They're very similar. I'm going to write them here for short: epinephrine and norepinephrine. And you've probably heard of these with the fight or flight response. And that is because they increase the glucose in our blood, just like the glucocorticoids do. They increase the blood flow, and they increase our heart rate. So when we're running a marathon, our heart rate is really high, and we also need to have a lot of glucose in our blood to give us the extra energy. And that's the adrenaline effects, which is what epinephrine and norepinephrine are responsible for.